Well, good evening. I'm joining you from the Russell Rotunda in the Russell Senate Office Building, where I just finished interviewing Senator Roy Blunt, and I spoke with the senator about a variety of policy topics important to him, including government debt and our historically high deficit. We're a long way from the dark days of 2009 and the Great Recession. The economic recovery that began under President Obama has kicked into overdrive under President Trump, and it's something Senator Blunt is happy to talk about.
The economy is strong. You've got unemployment at 3.7, growth, GDP growth over 4. The last time unemployment was 3.7 was 1969, and there were tens of thousands of young men being drafted in 1969. So their job was being drafted in the military. This may be the strongest economy that we've ever had. Certainly it's the strongest economy in 50 years, even counting going back to the Vietnam era.
But low unemployment and high GDP growth, which some may attribute to tax cuts, is only part of the overall economic picture. With reduced revenues and little curbing of federal spending, the government is on pace for trillion-dollar annual deficits, making our nation's long-term debt now over $20 trillion. But Blunt says President Trump, who has raised the debt issue only a few times during his administration, may not be the typical fiscal conservative.
Yeah, President Trump clearly did not run based on debt and deficit. Pledged to not reform the big entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. That makes it pretty hard to really deal with this whole issue if you don't do that. And of course, the minute somebody says, oh, he said reform Social Security and Medicare, that means they're going to cut my Social Security and Medicare. Remember, the last reform of Social Security and Medicare was President Reagan in 1982, and it's just now about to fully phase in. So this is something that if we would do it, there'd be plenty of time to prepare for. Nobody involved in those programs today would need to worry a bit, and nobody who would ultimately benefit from those programs wouldn't have plenty of time to think about, well, I'm going to retire at 67 in 1 month instead of 67, and that would be sometime in the future. So, you know, we really have to deal with that. We have to, I think, get our government more in line with our economy. The economy, you know, if the government, we tax about 19% of the economic wealth of the country produced annually, but we spend about 22%. So the difference, of course, is that growth. We've actually not increased spending in any way above inflation for a long time for the money we appropriate. Where the growth in the government is are those big programs where if you meet the definition of the program, you get the benefit of the program.
It's key to remember that the so-called entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are funded through FICA taxes that all workers pay, and those funds are supposed to be kept separate to pay beneficiaries. That's not the case, though, at least with Social Security and the trillions in IOUs that the U.S. Treasury owes the Social Security Administration. But the larger theme of fiscal discipline is one that Republicans were eager to tout during the Obama years, but now, not so much. Yet Blunt makes the case that his party is still more fiscally responsible than the alternative.
But we're definitely the party of priorities, in my view. You know, I started chairing 4 years ago the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Spending Committee, the Appropriating Committee. And with virtually no new money, we decided, no, one of our priorities is going to be healthcare research, which hadn't had an increase in 12 years. We've had a 30% increase over the last 4 years at a time when health research is particularly promising. But we had to do that by looking for programs that weren't working, trying to combine programs where you could combine programs, really finding $9 billion, most of it somewhere already that was being spent for something else. So we are the party that's willing, I think, to set priorities. But defending the country is one of our priorities, and you know, we're getting that amount of money where I think everybody who understands the national defense structure believes it needs to be. We're going to have to deal with these big issues. Probably the big lost opportunity of the Obama years was the best time to deal with these entitlement programs is when you have divided government, where both parties have to lock arms and say, This isn't the Republicans doing this or the Democrats doing it. It's the Republicans and the Democrats having to agree on a long-term strategy that does that. I'm on a special committee right now on budget and appropriating, and we're going to make some proposals that will be voted on at the end of November that will begin to get that process where it's more transparent. And one of the goals there would be to begin to look at what's coming in, what are we spending, and what is the acceptable difference between what we're spending, what's coming in, so that the deficit does get under control and eventually the debt becomes a real topic of discussion again.
So how does Blunt explain the president's preoccupation with issues other than the debt?
You know, I mean, one of the ways, of course, to get the deficit and debt under control is to grow the economy. And that's clearly the president's focus. It's the president's strength. What's happened with out-of-control regulators has made a big difference, maybe even a bigger difference than the tax structure itself.
And we'll have more of our interview with Senator Roy Blunt after this.
Something Senator Blunt talks about a lot are getting rid of what he calls senseless government regulations here in Washington.
I think the president's regulatory view has changed, so the regulations that are being pursued are maybe 180 degrees different than the kind of regulatory effort that was being made in the Obama years, where I do think you can make a strong argument that we need some regulations, but they need to meet the common sense test. They need to meet a cost-benefit analysis test. There's something called the Congressional Review Act, which gives the Congress and the President the ability to collectively review any regulation that comes through the administration. Now, the President part is the tricky part of that, because it's the President's administration until you get to the end of the administration. And so this act had been used exactly one time prior to 2017. We 15 times looked at regulations that were still available that were from the Obama era, and 15 times the Congress passed and the President agreed, no, that regulation is headed in the wrong direction. You know, we had there was one regulation that would have particularly affected where we live. It's called Waters of the U.S., where the definition of water, the definition of navigable water, which the EPA under the Clean Water Act had some authority over, navigable water had from 1846 on meant you could move something on it, so it was commerce. If you could move something on the water, that's commerce, that's the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So for a long time, there was a view that the federal government had responsibility for navigable water. But the Obama EPA decided that, well, navigable water, that really could be any water that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into navigable water. In our state, 99.3% of the land in Missouri would have been covered by the EPA's view of what should happen regarding water. If you're going to put in a new sidewalk, if you were going to mow the highway right away, if you were a farmer, and you were going to put fertilizer on your field, potentially all that would have had to have been signed off on by the EPA, and it would have had a devastating impact on construction, on infrastructure, on home building, on agriculture, and thank goodness that Waters of the U.S. is not going to go into effect. Just like there was a Clean Power Act that in our state would have doubled the average utility bill in about 10 or 12 years. Well, lots of things that work at today's utility bill don't work at double today's utility bill. That's not going to happen now. So big economic impact issues that would have had real negative impact with the regulations that were out there aren't going to have those impacts. Doesn't mean we don't want to have clean water. It doesn't mean that we want to have as clean a power and as diverse a power source as possible, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't double needlessly people's electric bill in a decade.
Senator Blunt serves on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I asked the senator what he thought were the key threats facing the United States in the 21st century.
Probably probably a cyber attack on some kind of critical infrastructure. You know, you could look at, we're so dependent on cyber now for water, for the financial infrastructure, the utility infrastructure, even the election infrastructure. And this whole cyber network was put in place without really thinking about cybersecurity. And we're trying to catch up as rapidly as we can, but I think anybody that looks at this carefully knows a state actor or a non-state actor could do devastating things to our network, and those networks are attacked all the time, and we fight back all the time. What we're not very good at yet, Brian, is we haven't figured out a way to have a cyber offense. It's not yet clearly understood what we would do if you could pinpoint a cyber attack and what your retaliation should be. But we're going to have to get to the point that particularly state-sponsored cyber attacks from Russia, from China, from North Korea, from Iran would be the four big actors right now that are constantly doing this. That if you find out that if they do that successfully, there has to be a major price to be paid. And I think we haven't yet figured out exactly how to, with certainty, pinpoint who caused the cyber attack, but we're getting close on that. And then what we would do in return if that cyber attack successfully happened.
I couldn't let the senator leave without asking him how he feels about being a senator now that he's well into his second term.
You know, I've had a chance to be a public official, an elected official for a long time. That's not as popular every day as it used to be, but this is a particularly exciting time. You know, world food need is going to double. World food demand is going to double between now and 2050. All these things are happening in healthcare research. I think we're beginning to talk about behavioral health like it's any other health issue. All those are things that I feel like I've been able to be at the forefront of. I think they're particularly good topics where we live, infrastructure, how we take advantage of location. Probably our biggest advantage as Missourians is where we live, where the rivers, the highways, and the rail systems of the country come together. How do we make the most of that? Rural broadband, another thing. So there are exciting things out there happening, and actually we're getting a lot more done than we'll get credit for, because there's so much else swirling around all the time that fills up the news. And so I'm going to be spending the next month talking about what this Congress really accomplished.
Brian Calfano, Ozarks First from Washington.